The preacher's daughter was halfway up the aisle when she stopped. Just stopped. Her hands went still around the bouquet of white roses her mother had spent 2 days arranging. The organ music faltered. 200 faces turned toward her in the packed church, every eye wide with shock. Then she dropped the flowers and ran. Not toward the door behind her. Toward the side entrance, the one that led to the woods beyond the churchyard. Her white dress tangled around her boots as she shoved through the door and kept running, the sound of her father's furious shout chasing her into the trees. But that was how it ended. This is how it began. 3 weeks earlier, Grace Holloway stood in the dry goods store in Timber Ridge, Montana, trying to convince the shopkeeper that her father's credit was still good. The man wouldn't meet her eyes. "I'm sorry, Miss Holloway. Reverend's been saying the Lord will provide for near on 6 months now, but the Lord ain't paid his account." Grace's cheeks burned. She set the sack of flour back on the counter with hands that wanted to shake but wouldn't. "I understand. Thank you for your time." Outside, the October wind cut through her wool coat. She walked with her head high past the women gathered near the post office, their whispers following her like crows. The preacher's family was broke. Everyone knew it. The church barely kept the roof patched. Her father gave away every cent that came through the collection plate. Believing poverty was holy and pride was sin. Grace believed in hard work and keeping her word. At 26, she was too old to be unmarried by Timber Ridge standards. Too tall, too serious, too likely to correct a man's scripture quotation in the middle of a conversation. Her mother called it her ungentle spirit. Her father called it the sin of intellectual vanity and prayed over her at the supper table until the food went cold. When Thomas Fairweather began courting her last spring, her father had wept with gratitude. Thomas owned the largest lumber mill in the valley. He was 43, twice widowed, soft-spoken, and respectable. He sat in the front pew every Sunday and nodded along to every sermon. He brought her flowers. He never tried to kiss her. He told her father he admired Grace's virtue and her steadiness. He never once asked Grace what she wanted, but he could pay the store accounts. He could fix the church roof. He could lift the weight of shame off her father's shoulders. So when Thomas proposed in her father's study with her father beaming beside him, Grace had said yes. Because that was what dutiful daughters did. The wedding was set for the first Saturday in November. The day Grace ran into Silas Drummond was the day everything changed. She'd gone to the North Timber to gather kindling, a task her mother considered unladylike, but Grace found necessary if they wanted to stay warm. The path wound through dense pine and aspen, far from town, far from watching eyes. She heard the axe before she saw the man. The sound rang clear and rhythmic through the cold air. She came around a bend and stopped. He was splitting logs beside a rough-built cabin she'd never seen before, though she'd walked these woods her whole life. The man was massive, shoulders broad as an ox yoke, arms thick with muscle that flexed and bunched with every swing. He'd stripped down to his undershirt despite the cold, and sweat darkened the fabric across his back. When he set the axe down and reached for his water tin, he saw her. Grace knew who he was instantly. Everyone in Timber Ridge knew of Silas Drummond, though few had seen him. He lived somewhere in the high timber, came to town maybe twice a year for supplies, and spoke to no one. Mothers used him to frighten children into obedience. Men spoke his name in low voices, always with the same warning: stay clear of Drummond's land. Rumor said he'd killed a man in a boxing ring back east. Others claimed he'd been a convict. Some swore he was just mad, driven to isolation by demons no preacher could cast out. Standing there with an armload of kindling, Grace saw a man with dark hair, a thick beard going gray at the edges, and eyes the color of winter sky. He watched her with the stillness of something wild, alert, wary, but not aggressive. "You're on my land," he said. His voice was deep and rough from disuse. "I didn't know. I apologize." She didn't run, didn't drop her eyes. "I was gathering wood." He looked at the pitiful bundle of sticks in her arms, then at the massive stack of split logs beside his cabin. Something moved across his face, not quite amusement, but close. "There's a dead spruce half-mile south. Already down. You can take what you need from there." "Thank you." She should have left. Instead, she heard herself ask, "Why does everyone fear you?" His eyes locked on hers. For a long moment, he didn't answer. "Because fear's easier than thinking," he finally said. Then he picked up his axe and turned back to his work, dismissing her. Grace walked home slowly, her mind full of a man who wasn't what the world said he was. She went back 3 days later. Grace told herself she was only going back for the firewood. The fallen spruce Silas had mentioned would keep them warm for a month, and pride was a sin, but freezing wasn't virtue. The truth was harder and brighter than that. She found him working on the cabin roof, replacing shingles with fresh split cedar. He glanced down when she approached, hammer in hand, a nail between his teeth. He took it out. Spruce is that way. He pointed south with the hammer. I know. I wanted to thank you properly first. He climbed down the ladder in 3 long strides. Up close, he was even larger than she'd thought, tall enough that she had to tilt her chin up, and she wasn't a small woman. But his movements were careful, controlled. A man aware of his own strength. No fakes needed. Nevertheless, she held out a bundle wrapped in kitchen cloth. Cornbread. I made extra. He stared at it like she'd offered him a rattlesnake. Why? Because you showed me kindness. Told you where a dead tree was. That ain't kindness. That's just sense. In my experience, Mr. Drummond, sense and kindness aren't as common as they should be. He took the bundle slowly. Their fingers didn't touch, but the air between them felt suddenly charged, like the moment before lightning strikes. Silas, he said, don't need the mister. Grace. I know. At her surprised look, he added, preacher's daughter. Everyone knows. She smiled, sharp and wry. Yes, the burden of my existence. Something flickered in his eyes, recognition, maybe, understanding. He unwrapped the cornbread, broke off a piece, and ate it standing there. His expression didn't change, but he finished the piece and took another. It's good, he said simply. It was the best compliment she'd received in years. Grace came back the following week with a book, Marcus Aurelius, borrowed from the circuit judge's wife. She'd seen the small shelf of volumes inside Silas's cabin during her first visit. Their spines cracked from reading. Thought you might like this, she said, handing it to him. He turned it over in his large, scarred hands. You read philosophy? When I can. My father thinks it's vanity. He prefers I stick to scripture and homemaking manuals. Your father's a fool. The words were so blunt, so honest, that Grace laughed. A real laugh. Bright and unfettered. Silas's mouth quirked at the corner. Almost a smile. They sat on the split log bench outside his cabin and talked until the shadows grew long. He'd been a stonemason in Pennsylvania, he told her. Good work, good pay. But the cities felt like cages, all noise and crowds, and people who measured a man's worth by his manners instead of his hands. And the rumors? Grace asked. The killing, the prison? I broke a man's jaw in a fight. He'd been beating his horse bloody in the street. Sheriff said I should have walked away. I said the horse couldn't. Silas's jaw tightened. Spent 30 days in jail. Came west when I got out. Figured if people were going to call me a brute, might as well live where being strong and quiet is just living. You're not a brute. His eyes cut to hers, startled. You're just a man who refused to ignore suffering, Grace continued. That's not brutality. That's conscience. No one had ever defended him before. She could see it in his face. When she finally stood to leave, Silas walked her to the edge of his property line. The sun was setting, turning the pine forest gold and crimson. You don't have to keep coming back, he said, but his voice was careful. Uncertain. I know. Town finds out you're spending time up here. They'll talk. They already talk. This'll be different. Worse. Grace met his eyes directly. Let them talk. She came back every week after that. Sometimes she brought food. Sometimes books. Sometimes just herself, and they'd sit in companionable silence while he worked, and she read aloud. The wedding drew closer. Thomas Fairweather began visiting the house more frequently, discussing arrangements with her father. Grace smiled and nodded, and felt like she was watching her own life from a great distance. Then, 1 week before the wedding, Thomas came to supper. He was talking about the honeymoon, a trip to Helena, staying at a fine hotel, when he mentioned, almost casually, that he'd purchased the timber rights to the northern forest. Grace's fork stopped halfway to her mouth. The North Timber? Yes. Excellent stand of old-growth pine. My crews will start clearing it in the spring. Thomas smiled. Your father suggested the purchase, actually. Said it would be a fine wedding gift, profitable and practical. Her father beamed. The Lord provides, Thomas. He provides. Grace's voice came out steady despite the roaring in her ears. There's a cabin up there. Someone lives on that land. Thomas waved a hand. A squatter. No deed, no claim. He'll move on when the crews arrive. If he doesn't, the sheriff will encourage him. That night, Grace didn't sleep. She stood at her window and watched the moon rise over the mountains and understood with perfect clarity that she had a choice to make. She could marry Thomas, live in comfort, let him destroy Silas's home, and cut down the forest that had become her refuge. She could be a good daughter, a dutiful wife, a silent woman, or she could run. The morning of the wedding, Grace dressed in her mother's white gown. She pinned her dark hair out with trembling fingers. She picked up the bouquet, and when the organ began to play, she walked down that aisle. Halfway to Thomas, she looked at her father's proud face, her mother's anxious eyes, the town's expectant stares. Then she dropped the flowers and ran. Grace didn't stop running until her lungs burned and her legs shook. The white dress was a ruin, mud splattered and torn at the hem where it had caught on brambles. She could hear shouting behind her, her father's voice rising above the others, but she didn't look back. The path to Silas's cabin was steep and rough. She climbed it in her wedding dress and ruined boots, her breath coming in gasps. He was at the woodpile when she stumbled into the clearing. He turned, axe in hand, and went absolutely still. Grace stood there, chest heaving, hair falling loose around her shoulders, the white dress stark against the dark trees. For a moment, neither of them moved. Grace. His voice was low, urgent. What happened? I ran. The words came out half laugh, half sob. I was standing there, and I realized I couldn't do it. I couldn't marry him. I couldn't watch them take this place from you. I couldn't. She broke off, pressing a hand to her mouth. Silas set down the axe very carefully. They'll come looking for you. I know. Your father will be furious, humiliated. Yes. Grace straightened her spine. I don't care. He took a step toward her, then stopped, like he didn't trust himself to get closer. Grace, think about what you're doing. You run from this, there's no going back. Town'll call you ruined, disgraced. Your family. My family sold me to save their pride and fix a church roof. Her voice shook but didn't break. Thomas bought timber rights to clear your land as a wedding gift. They were going to destroy this place come spring, Silas. Destroy your home. And I was supposed to smile and thank him for it. Silas's hands curled into fists at his sides. He bought the logging rights. All of it. The whole northern valley. Son of a. Silas bit off the curse, turning away sharply. Then he turned back. Grace, I got no claim to this land. No deed. I've been squatting here 10 years, but that don't make it mine in the eyes of the law. Then we'll get you a claim. How? I got money saved, but not enough for lawyers and land offices, and I have money. Grace's chin came up. My grandmother left me $500 in trust. It comes to me at marriage or at age 30, whichever comes first. My father's been trying to access it for years, but the bank won't release it. She took a breath. But if I marry, it's mine to use. Silas stared at her. You can't mean, marry me. The words came clear and sure. Right now, today, we'll ride to the mining camp at Silver Creek. There's a territorial judge there who performs marriages. By tomorrow, the money's released, and we file a homestead claim on this land before Thomas's crews ever set foot here. Grace. Silas's voice was rough. You can't throw your whole life away for what? For you? She crossed the distance between them, looking up into his stunned face. Silas Drummond, you're the only person in this entire valley who's ever asked me what I think, what I want, what I believe. You listen when I talk about philosophy and don't tell me it's unwomanly. You see me, not just the preacher's daughter or a solution to someone's problems. Do you have any idea how rare that is? His hands came up slowly, hovered near her shoulders, but didn't touch. You barely know me. I know you read Marcus Aurelius by lamplight. I know you stopped coming to town because people feared what they didn't understand. I know you served 30 days in jail for defending a horse that couldn't defend itself. Grace's eyes burned, but no tears fell. I know that in 3 months, you've shown me more respect than Thomas Fairweather did in a year of courtship. So yes, I know you. And I'm choosing you. I'm choosing this. If you'll have me. Silas's breath came rough and unsteady. I got nothing to offer you, Grace. No fine house, no society, no easy life. I don't want easy. I want real. You'll be cut off from your family, the church, everything you've known. Everything I've known has been a cage. She reached up, laid her palm against his bearded cheek. This is freedom. Silas closed his eyes. When he opened them, they blazed with something fierce and unguarded. You're sure? I've never been more sure of anything. He caught her hand, pressed it harder against his face, then turned his head and kissed her palm. The gesture was so tender, so full of reverence, that Grace felt tears finally slip free. Then we ride now, Silas said. Before they get here, they made Silver Creek by nightfall. The judge was a grizzled man who'd seen everything the frontier could throw at him and wasn't surprised by a mud-splattered bride and a mountain man asking for a quick wedding. He charged $2, signed the certificate, and wished them luck. You're gonna need it, he said, not unkindly. By the time Reverend Holloway and a group of furious men from Timber Ridge reached Silas's cabin the next day, it was empty. They found a note nailed to the door in Grace's careful handwriting. The land is legally claimed under Homestead Act, filed this day with Territorial Office. All logging contracts hereby void. Do not follow us. I have made my choice freely and before God. Grace Holloway Drummond. 3 months later, spring came to the northern Montana timber. In a cabin newly expanded with a stone hearth and glass windows, Grace Drummond stood at a table covered in surveying maps and legal documents. The homestead claim had gone through. Thomas Fairweather's logging rights were nullified. The valley was theirs, 160 acres of pine forest, clear streams, and quiet. Silas came in from the woodshed, stopping snow from his boots. He'd let Grace trim his beard shorter, and he'd started smiling more, real smiles that crinkled the corners of his eyes. Letter came, he said, holding out an envelope. Grace recognized her mother's handwriting. She opened it slowly. Your father will not speak your name. But I need you to know, you looked happier running out of that church than I have felt in 20 years of standing inside it. I do not know if I will ever have the courage you showed, but I am glad you did. Your mother. Grace pressed the letter to her chest, eyes closing. Silas wrapped his arms around her from behind, resting his chin on top of her head. You all right? Yes. She turned in his arms. I'm home. Outside, the forest stood tall and untouched. Inside, a fire crackled warm. And Grace Holloway, who'd been told her whole life to be small and quiet and obedient, lived loud and free and entirely on her own terms. The preacher's daughter had run from her wedding, straight into the arms of the man everyone feared, and she'd never looked back.